Hi everyone, and welcome to the finalist voting for the Maven Hospital Challenge. Today, we'll be looking at the 5 projects up for the main prize, and we'll be evaluating them by using the challenge objective, which was to build a top-level KPI dashboard that helps a hospital's executive team quickly understand its recent performance in key areas. Now, as always, we'll consider each project as a whole, including the description, images, and embedded reports. So let's get started.
First up is Andrew Chingati. Before I dive into the dashboard itself, I just want to commend Andrew for an awesome write-up. So, one of the things we love to see is kind of a straightforward, layout of the problem, as well as the intention behind, who you're creating this dashboard for. He also includes a little bit about metric definition. This is something that I would have liked to see a little bit more of. But overall, I think what I love most about this is that for each of the major questions, he is providing key insights, as well as implications for the executive team, followed by recommendations for improving those target metrics. So this is really actionable. It's really descriptive, distilling all of the insights that he was able to derive from this data. And I think, generally speaking, when you produce an executive dashboard like this, you also want to produce an executive summary. And I think that's what he's done here. And I think that's really effective. But I do think, I don't always ask for this, but I think in the case of this challenge, because there were some assumptions made about certain metric calculations, which we'll see, I would have liked to see a little bit more of the technical backing for, how we're creating these metrics, not just from, a sentence level. So he'll say, like, I went with the definition of admission being the time a patient occupies a hospital bed under the care of hospital staff, usually overnight, as defined by USC. So I like that he included a source for how he defined admissions. But because that is quite a complex metric to tackle, I think I would like to see how he did that behind the scenes with the raw data. So moving on to the metric, overall, I love Andrew's layout here. I think, there is a lot of data in this set here and challenge, and we'll see a wide range of complexity in terms of what's offered by the challenge participants. And a lot of the times less is more. And I love that he includes the metrics that answer all of the key prompt questions in an effective and easy to read layout. So we start with patients in a given period, average stay, and then for each of these metrics, he's providing us with year-over-year metrics so the executives can understand if our metrics are moving in the right or the wrong direction, and what actions, if they're moving in the wrong direction, they might take. So that is really effective there. I don't have a ton of notes on the layout. I think overall, he answers the key questions there. But in terms of the analysis, there's 1 or 2 metrics that stick out to me as things that might be worth digging into further. So in his write-up, he mentions that readmission rate was 100%, which means that everybody that's treated as an admission stays overnight, comes back later on to stay overnight. And this is where having the technical backing behind this metric would really help us dig into whether or not, based on how he's, said he's calculating this, if that's correct, or if there's a technical error. But when we look at other participants, 100% really isn't seen. And it just, to me, kind of raises a red flag in terms of that seems extremely high. In real life, like, it's hard for me to believe that every single admitted patient would then have a readmission. And we see this for just about every year. So focusing in on this last 30-day readmission rate. And then alongside that, the other issue, which was common, this was kind of a hidden landmine in the data. But in 2014, there were some data errors that caused the average stay to be extremely high. So just again, looking at, 2020, 2012, 2013, in the 2-hour range, skipping over to 2015, 2-hour range. But 2014 has this 38-hour average stay, which again is either like just the most insane outlier that could ever happen in a hospital, or there's data issues. So I think the biggest thing I would say is when we do see very odd things like that, really show us technically like how you're correct, or it might be an indication that like we need to, dig a little bit deeper and do some additional cleaning. But that aside, I think like that is an issue that, when you're working on this in the real world, a couple of conversations with your key stakeholders will help massage this out. But overall, I think Andrew did a really good job of presenting a project that's going to be useful for executives after maybe a little bit of back and forth on those metrics. So really well done, Andrew.
Yeah, I love this one, Chris. I love your thoughts. I think one thing that now that you were talking about the length of stay calculations and how you have that kind of 2014 outlier, I think in general though, like if you go to a normal year, click on whichever one, like you still see those like 1.77 hour, 20 to like 2 hour, et cetera, et cetera. And those are actually also inflated by the inpatient category, and we have the bar chart there. So I think you can actually click on inpatient, and it'll give you, the average for those, because they're staying overnight,
Yeah.
tends to be about 1 day. But if you click on any other one, say, ambulatory or whatever, urgent care, like those are like I wish that they'd split it into two, right? Like, especially since he's already talking about admissions being different than an encounter, right? An admission is someone that stays for a long period. That's like a completely separate kind of like hospital visit, if we want to call it that. So let's calculate average lengths of stay for those and for the rest, and kind of keep those as separate metrics. Otherwise, the average is kind of meaningless. So I think that's like one thing there. You could have just added the filter. I know you can click on the bars. It's not very intuitive, and you can't, just exclude inpatient. So I think that's one minor thing that I kind of noticed about this one. But other than that, I think it really just, in a high level dashboard, covered everything we were looking for. And I actually really love that table at the bottom with the insurance, like the insurance costs and the coverage by, like, I think that might be one of my favorite ways of showing that piece, because I think the trend is a little bit, I think a lot of people did trend for coverage and you wouldn't really notice any patterns. There's more trends in other types of things like admissions, things like that. But here, just in general, like, how does it cover, like, how is each agent's, insurance agency covering? I think it's pretty neat. So yeah, this is a great one. And I love the way that they structured the report as well, with these like very stakeholder forward.
Yeah. And to your point, like I will say, like, in terms of the complexity of the data, as well as like, how much subject matter knowledge would really be required to, do this data justice, like your point, like the inpatient versus outpatient nuance, like there is a lot to really like understand here. It's very complex data. So I think, given that, like, and given the fact that these folks are jumping into this from a variety of backgrounds, like it's not going to be uncommon necessarily to see a few of those gaps. And again, like, yeah, I think we can be like, there's probably a little bit of room for grace here. But yeah, overall, I agree with your sentiment there.
Yeah, one thing to just quickly call out is I also love the layout of this, right? It's very easy to understand and intuitive. And Enrique was going to make a very similar point about the table visual down at the bottom there. I think this whole page becomes infinitely more valuable by adding in the visit type bar chart, right? Without that added like categorical like filterability, right? Like you lose a lot of these insights and stuff. So I think, again, if I'm being super critical about this, you could potentially remove that, as an average cost or average treatment cost by visit type, right? And just use the visit type, and you kind of understand like, hey, the hospital in 2011 did more inpatient than urgent care, right? You can kind of understand the volume that way. But then when it's filtered, you can say like, okay, my average treatment cost for inpatient was this, right? As a collective group, the average treatment cost was this, right? So it's like, I love having like that single visual tied to the filtering capability for the rest of the dashboard. Really makes this so impactful from like a high level, and then, providing a little bit of ability to dig in to more specific areas. So
yeah, I think the only thing that I was going to say is I'm really impressed by how simple this is and how easy it is to interpret. I think we'll kind of see as we move through some of the other entries that people tended to use lots of pages, lots of charts and graphs. And while I think that that has its own place, this is a really, really incredible way to show that like you can put all of this stuff on one page. And I'm sure that executives probably appreciate that ability to kind of have that like at a glance, this is exactly the information that I need to know. And this is, presented to me in a way that I understand. So I think it's really impressive that Andrew was able to kind of get all of this comprehensively on one page with so much information packed in there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's why this stands out for sure.
awesome. All right. So I had the privilege of reviewing Mark Long's challenge submission. And before I dig into to Mark's dashboard, I was thinking a little bit about the challenge prompt here, and we were kind of talking about this as we were reviewing a lot of the submissions. And the question came up around, what is an executive level KPI report, right? Specifically in the context of this challenge or for a hospital style data set, right? And I think Mark actually does a really good job of addressing this in his about this project section, because immediately my kind of honest reaction to the dashboard was that I was looking at this and it's like, wow, this is really complex. It's very densely populated. And I'm like, there's no way that this qualifies as that kind of executive level or executive style KPI report. I dug in a little bit more and I realized there's actually a lot of examples of, what potential executives at hospitals would actually potentially, want to look at. I actually did a little bit of research just at some like annual reports, that hospitals tend to use. And those types of reports end up being very jam-packed with lots of 3D bar charts I was finding, which were cringeworthy. But, they're very densely populated. There's a lot of detail, a ton of information there. So kind of, being critical about that definition in the context of the challenge, I actually think that Mark does a pretty good job here of creating that executive style KPI report that a hospital executive would look at. And in his About This Project section, Mark speaks to that. So he talks about, some of his key steps here, starting off with data exploration and basically how he's breaking down the report. It is a 3-page report, tons of information, but he's breaking it down into non-admissions, admissions, and then readmissions, and then finally procedures, which is where he covers a lot of the cost-related items. He's talking about the different attributes that are covered here. And he talks about it in terms of, again, like thinking about this in terms of KPIs, that kind of patient information, details about the encounters, more general metrics for the encounters and procedures, and then special metrics, right? And I think once you kind of dig into the report, you can kind of see this follows the detail from top to bottom of how the report pages are set up. So kind of putting everything together here, I really think Mark does a great job of setting the stage for what to expect within the report. Data preparation piece here was great. Understanding what he did in Power Query. Again, this is all very high level stuff that he's calling out here, but again, talking about building and adding in different dimension tables to make the data model work within Power BI. Some of the extracting of hour per column for the visit data to get stuff to work, right? So really great stuff here. Same thing with the data model, calling out some of the logical pieces and the preparation and steps that you need to take. He also has a couple of definitions here for admissions, and then initial admissions and readmissions and what those mean, right? So again, just a great job of adding in those definitions into the About This Project section. So with all that, I totally get that this report contains a ton of information and it is overwhelming at first to look at. So what I kind of want to talk about, there's so many different visual elements here. It was really hard to kind of focus either on the whole thing or specific charts or visuals. So I think what I want to kind of talk through is how I interpreted Mark looking at the different KPIs for each page. All right, so if we start on the encounter page here by non-admissions, right, we start talking about total encounters, and we see that composition broken down by admissions and non-admissions, and then have some, trends to kind of understand are those increasing or decreasing over time. He's got great text and supporting text underneath these visuals to kind of call out, what this means and the date ranges and that kind of stuff. I really like the overall admission encounters here by the different patient segments, right? So talking about male versus female, different age ranges for seniors or young adults, that kind of stuff. And then talking about race at the end here as well. Not a huge fan of this many slices on the donut, but again, get the idea here. And then last, length of stay in minutes for non-admissions, and kind of seeing that trend, as we go along, basically from 15 minutes, which we have seen like a lot of these non-admission cases tend to happen pretty quickly, up to, those that are over an hour. So again, I think from a KPI standpoint, these cards they do contain a lot of detail, but, Mark is calling out those kind of top level KPIs that, people might care about for the admissions and non-encounters, or the encounters non-admission segment. So jumping over to the admissions and readmissions page, I really feel like it's the same story here, right? Kind of have these 3 KPI visuals at the top. It's a little bit of a different form than we tend to see with like those big numbers. But again, we're looking at admission and readmission count, right? And we're looking at those audience sizes by total encounters and then breaking that down into readmissions. And then here we've got, of admitted patients, what does that look like total? And then we kind of see that the percentage and the volume for readmissions here. And again, one of the things that I liked here and that other reports kind of tended to show is that 100% readmission rate, depending on how stuff was calculated. And I like that this is a small subset of the admitted patients, or of that total encounter segment as well. We've got this admission trends by month. Again, I really like this visual here. He calls out in the title, or specifically calls out the use of color in the title here, where he's using that to denote warm and cold seasons. So you can kind of get an understanding of like the increases and decreases based on, the temperature or average temperature in the region. So kind of cool there. And then the admission and discharge is turnover by month. And I love this chart. I think that this is super cool that you can see, the admissions and discharges that trend over time. And again, the way that I'm starting to think about this is, execs are able to understand their turnover, right? And then you can layer in like number of beds, or like, there's so many different data points that you could layer in here to go deeper into this. But from a high level, you can kind of clearly understand, volume and then that turnover. So again, these are kind of those 3 KPI visuals for that second page. And then finally, once the procedures page loads here, at the top, we really have those more kind of typical, KPI cards where we're looking at total procedures, the average cost per the procedure, unclaimed procedure cost, and then our average daily procedures as well. So again, very densely populated. Even on these KPI visuals, there's a ton of information even packed in here. But again, just kind of taking a step back, I really think that Mark does do a good job at putting together a dashboard that shows the KPIs that an executive team would care about, plus a ton of additional detail that goes into the context and some of the segments and that are behind each of the numbers here. So again, I love that he's adding in all of these definitions and the supporting detail throughout the other visuals and on the page. But again, like if we're being critical about it, it is a lot to go through and interpret. And I spent a decent amount of time, kind of going through and understanding it. So I think if there was an opportunity here, it's, really kind of creating a one sheeter, if you will, and maybe that one sheeter is just a kind of, it's potentially like a pared down version of these main KPIs by encounters, admissions and readmissions, and then procedures. Where like, hey, here's what you need to care about, and then link out to the pages with more detail. Again, just a suggestion there, but Mark, great job overall. Really, really thorough, really well done.
Yeah, I agree with that feedback at the end there. Like there's so many brilliant ideas in this dashboard. It's really hard not to like love, but at the same time, it takes quite a while for you to realize how brilliant it is. For example, just now you were mentioning like the coding by like color, like temperature of months. And that's actually really smart because, flu season, even like COVID tends to spike in the winter months. That's why we all get our vaccines around then. So like helping just delineate those months really kind of highlights like when we expect things to be high. And then if we see high admissions in warm months, that might be something to like investigate further as an anomaly that is outside of our normal seasonal pattern there. So like, it's just really, and there are tons of nuggets in this. It's just like, when you open it up, you're like, whoa, like takes, it takes a lot of education to get up and running on. So I would have loved to see, those top metrics, like you said, all put onto a front page, and then having all of the supporting data if and when executives need to go a layer or two deeper. It's very accessible, but like still keeping them, I can log in on a daily or weekly basis, understand how things are going at a high level. And then if I see something off or I'm interested in digging in deeper, I can move into like, secondary, that more complex page. But this is like, there's so much amazing thought put into this. It's hard not to love.
Yeah, I will second what Chris said. I also really like, I typically don't love a lot of text on a dashboard, and this may be kind of the exception to that rule. I appreciate having kind of definitions so I know exactly what he's referring to, especially with like the idea of an admission and a readmission. Like, what exactly does that mean to Mark, and how is he looking at that? But even some of the, just some of the notes here are really insights that are very important and could be really helpful to executives. So I think it if we're going to go ahead and have this many charts and this much information, I think it needs to almost be supported with those text insights to kind of bring it all together. So I actually really appreciated that.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. I think next, and we'll see that cover page. I think Nicoline has one, right, Lauren, that they kind of like dig deeper. So I really do second that thought. But to all of your points, there's so much good stuff here. It's kind of a shame that at first you don't even want to look at it because it's so much. But one comment that I will make, well, two comments. One on this page, I love the funnels here. I know I think we don't get as many like wrong uses of funnel charts anymore, but this one's kind of brilliant. And it like even beyond the fact that we have what an admission is, what a readmission is defined, like here it's very easy to see where the percentages come from, right? Like, yes, it's one thing to say overall readmission rate is 33.1%, right? And that's at the bottom of like underneath these funnels. But here, like if you look at that top funnel, okay, 4.1 of total encounters are admissions, and then from there, 54 are the ones like first time admitted, and 33% of those are the ones that are readmitted after 30 days. So I think it's just a brilliant way of showing that. And then once you look at the trends like by financial year, which is another great decision to use financial year, by the way, I don't think anyone else did that. It's just great to see those trends by year compared to that average line that he adds there. One other thing that I loved in the first page, I know I talked about the length of stay kind of clarifications where, oh, inpatients, like those are closer to a day. The others like separate that into two. But, like, I think even the best way of showing that is like a histogram, and that top right corner, like, yeah, even if you show that it's like the average, if you take out inpatients, will be closer to like 40 minutes or whatever. The reality is that most people are in and out like within 15 minutes, right? So I think showing that is super clever. And then you calculate the average without those 15 minutes, which is that 38.24. So again, so many smart choices here. When I found this data set online and shared it as part of the challenge, I didn't do it. Obviously, I didn't do a deep dive like this one, but I was even wondering like how far can someone take the data here, because it's so rich and it's so realistic to the hospital environment. And I think just seeing this report kind of just like made my day, in that like, wow, like there's so much, gold to dig into here. And I know what the prompt kind of wasn't that deep and on purpose, because then it's easier to get lost in the rabbit hole. But the fact that Mark clearly didn't get lost and was able to uncover all this good stuff, it's kind of amazing to see, even if again it's maybe a little bit outside the challenge prompt. But I can't really say many bad things about this.
Yeah, like as all you guys are providing feedback and talking about like either new or evolving perspectives, it's like this seasonality check for the non-admissions encounters, like this is a whole like deep dive in itself, right, that you can go through, right? Just this visual. On the admissions and readmissions page, there's a 30-day mortality rate, and he defines what that is. But like that is fascinating. Like just digging into that data and understanding like where, like what kinds of trends and stuff. So again, just to echo everything, there's so much, great work here and a bunch of points that are, worthwhile to dig into. That again, a little restructuring, for surfacing those high level KPIs, but you could probably spin off a handful of other reports just from this that are really digging into some of those areas and provide additional value there. So yeah, just awesome work here.
Okay, so I'm really excited to be talking about Nicoline's project today, and I am particularly impressed by this entry because she is by background a UX designer who wanted to learn more about data analytics. And I think for that reason, I can really tell how much she focused on the design and the usability behind her report, which is just amazing, especially kind of thinking about the prompt and who it's meant to be used for. So before we kind of dive in a little bit more, I do want to talk about her about this section, or about this project section. I really love that Nicoline outlined the goals for herself in this challenge. So it's not so much the challenge questions, which I also really appreciate when people include them, but this is really like talking about what she hopes to do for herself and for her own kind of knowledge. And based on these, I think that she has really accomplished a lot of them. I also really appreciated that she calls out these assumptions that she's operating under. And I know that we've kind of talked about this, what is an encounter, what is an admission? I thought it was really clever for her to use the help of ChatGPT to kind of define that. I think we've seen a couple of different approaches, but this is just sort of a fun one that I think could potentially make a lot of sense in the long run. So I liked that she called that out. Two more quick things before we look at the report itself. I always think that it's a good idea to kind of talk about what improvements can be made for the future. I think a lot of the time we talk about, dashboards and reports as iterations. There's going to be updates and tweaks and things that people would want to see that's not on V1. And so kind of thinking about what the future looks like and what improvements could be made is really great to include here. It's kind of forward thinking, talking about what else can I learn? What else can I apply here? The other thing that I really, really like, and again, I think this has to do with Nicoline being a UX designer by background, is that she really focuses on this data storytelling. And she specifically said, if you think my report looks simple, awesome, that means I achieved my goal. For the record, I really do think that she achieved this goal of hers. So looking at the report itself, Nicoline mentions that she wanted to build this based on the MGH, the Mass General style guide. And so we can look at her report and see kind of what this looks like. And then can look at Mass General's actual website, and you'll see a very, very similar theme here. Same colors, same picture, same kind of boxed out boxes that you can click on. So just, I really appreciated that from the perspective of somebody who is looking at this and thinking again, as an executive, it would be really cool. I think it really is cohesive and ties together what she's doing here. The other thing that I really like about this first page is that it almost reminds me of like a basic search engine page that I might see. I think that you kind of need to keep stakeholders at the very top of mind when you're creating any type of report. And my assumption is that almost anyone can navigate this dashboard, which means she did a really great job with usability. So, I really appreciated how easy it is to kind of look at this and see exactly what she wants to do here. I think the other thing that she does really well is, again, top level KPI dashboard. She has a really great balance between too little information and too much, with a lot of opportunity to kind of dig in further to each section. So this front cover page kind of gives us just a very high level quarter to date overview of what's going on, with the ability to click into each section and see more. So if I look at, for instance, more about costs, I think it's a really great idea for her to use very simple line charts and column charts. They're classics for a reason. They make sense. Everybody can look at them very quickly and interpret what they mean. So really great usage of charts there. I also really liked the top insurance companies. I think it was great to kind of see exactly what percentage of things were covered, the number of patients, all of that information in a really quick glance here. So I really loved Nicoline's approach, and I think she did a fantastic job. There are a few things that I think that she could do that would have a really big impact. One of the things that I took a minute to kind of understand was why certain KPI cards weren't changing as I updated filters. After kind of playing around with it for a minute, I realized that when you change the year filter, the quarter to date KPIs don't change, which makes a lot of sense. But even though it seems kind of obvious to someone who's working with this data, I always favor kind of being as clear as possible, even if that does mean kind of over communicating some of those things. One thing I really did love about her KPI cards actually is that she has this change. I would love if it was a little bit more clearly called out, quarter over quarter is kind of what we're looking at here. But what I really do like is that she doesn't have any positive or negative colors associated with this. And I think we've seen that in a couple of challenge entries. And typically I kind of love that quick, green means good, red means bad. But in this case, it's a little bit harder to determine what's good and bad. Is it good for the hospital that they had more visits and more admissions this year or this quarter? Is it bad for the hospital that, insurance paid less money? So I think that kind of having it be more neutral is really appropriate in the situation. One of the other things here that I think that we've talked about before is, looking at some of the data a little bit more closely. For instance, Nicoline didn't take out any of the outliers from 2014. So some of her data is a little bit kind of skewed based off of that. And then the last thing that I kind of would like to have seen is a little bit more maybe defining what certain things are. So you can click on this little dictionary in the upper right-hand corner and see that Nicoline did a great job with defining a lot of kind of basic ideas. The one thing that I would have loved to see is her definition of readmissions and re-encounters. I think it could really help with kind of clarity, helping people understand exactly what they're looking at and what those terms specifically mean to her. But overall, I'm really impressed with Nicoline's entry here, and she did a fantastic job.
I like the fake email address at the bottom too. I'm going to try emailing that and ask about it.
I think one of the things that I really liked is if you go to page 2,
Is that encounters?
yeah, or cost.
Okay.
Yeah, so the insurance coverage and uninsured costs by class, right? Like I really like the stacked bar chart here. Like it was a super clean and tangible way to understand what was and wasn't covered by insurance, right? So again, like to your point about like what's good and bad for the hospital, right? Is if insurance is covering a larger percentage, does that mean that they get paid more reliably and faster? Right, versus if it's a patient coverage thing and then they've got to potentially, chase down payments or, that kind of stuff. But I think that chart mixed with the filter pane to be able to break it down by insurance company. So you could say something like, hey, like Blue Cross Blue Shield is a huge provider in the Boston area, right? And now you start to see the percentage of, those, ambulatory visits, are how much of that is actually covered by insurance, right? So I start going to like a marketing mindset where it's like, how are you, helping, drive people, more patients to your hospital purely based on something like a coverage type or something like that. So again, I really like how this visual is set up. And I think using the stacked bar here is a great way to, quickly see a lot of great insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's been happening to me with all of these so far, but the more you spend time with them, the better they get. Again, that cover page that we kind of felt was missing from Marx's, I just love here. It's so simple, right? Like, and I know I've been nagging about the same subjects, but we go to the last one, how long are patients staying in the hospital? Very clearly split between visit and admission, right? We have those same great funnels. I think to your point, Lauren, on the definitions of encounters, re-encounters, and readmissions, it seems to me like the readmission just means here that at some point in time they were readmitted versus at a 30-day threshold or an X day threshold, which was what a lot of people defined it as. And I think that might be a miss here, but something that you can very easily modify. So I wouldn't knock any points. But yeah, I think if you go back to the homepage, the only thing that if I had to be overly critical, like I love the quarter to dates, especially because that's the focus of the entire report. But that middle one is over time. I'm not sure why. Like I'd love to have total admissions quarter to date in the context versus the previous quarter, same with readmissions. But other than that, I think this is just a really great, and obviously very thoughtfully designed reports, which I mean, if this is someone that's just learning to be an analyst, that's unbelievable. This is really like a lot of very smart decisions were made. I guess maybe something about being a designer lets you know that you have to leave stuff out, and that's more important than what you include. So maybe that speaks to why this is such a good report. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a very slight nitpick. Like, I don't know if this web page type design is really the ideal landing page for just showing a picture of a generic doctor for an executive report. Like, it feels like I'm on a public facing web page, so it's a public information site versus an internal executive KPI. That said, it the context of her saying her goal was to practice with HTML makes me feel like a lot, this is just a really good example to get this experience with using a style guide, using high level navigation page. But I just matter of taste, I don't know if this would every single time I'm going to look at my metrics and I see this very happy doctor, if that's really what I would want to see on the workplace. But I don't think that really affects my judgment of this. Just want to point that out, I guess.
So Chris wants to see mean, angry doctors on these pages. No.
Well, it should be happy if the metrics are good, and then angry if the metrics are bad. Yeah.
Nice. I like it. All right. So up next, we have Michael Pason. Again, this was a really, I think, clean and I'll call it kind of a clever submission. And what really stood out to me is this is going to come off as wrong potentially, but I mean this as a compliment, the sparseness of the first page. It's a very purpose-built page. And Michael does a great job of calling out his exact rationale behind why he built it this way. And he does this in a really well, and I think pretty thorough about this project section. So Michael jumps in and starts talking about the main goal of the actual challenge. And he bolds the text here where his purpose behind this report, which we can kind of see within this first page, is to make sure that the hospital's executive team can quickly understand recent performance in a few key areas, right? So just kind of looking at this hospital page or this first page of the report, you really understand that I've got these 4 big boxes here, all with big numbers. I've got increase, decrease metrics. It looks like we've got some context here, right? So it's a very much set up in that way as like a quick at a glance report. So I love that he's starting off as about this section that way. And then when you're looking at that report, he really does pay that off very well. Talks about the data set a little bit. And then he gets right into the, for the assignment, like his approach to the project. So using that first page is that high level KPI overview for the executive team. And then that second page is more of an explanatory overview of the data provided. And he offers or provides some recommendations to the executive team there as well. From a data cleaning standpoint, I always love this. Again, it's great when you can get an understanding and some insight into the assumptions and the steps that people take to, clean up, augment, take out outliers or nuance within the data set. So he's saying he didn't do much here, but cleaning up some null values and just making sure that everything, like some of the categorical names, were usable and consistent, that kind of stuff. So really nice work there. The report structure, I really, really liked this detail specifically where he's talking about, the 5 KPIs that he's visualizing on that first page. And again, reiterating that within just a few seconds, I want people to understand these kind of main areas. So he talks a little bit about the first 4 of those 5 KPIs. And then he digs into the 5th KPI, which is really focused on the hospital bed occupancy. And there's a really cool chart that he uses to kind of talk about this. And what's really cool here is that he talks about some assumptions that he made, right, when he was creating not only this measure, but in trying to visualize the data as well. So we provide some great supporting text here. And then this is like eye candy for me, right? Seeing all the DAX called out here. Again, from a DAX standpoint, the use of variables is fantastic, right? That helps speed up performance. It helps it, be super readable and understandable to understand, like, hey, he's calculating all these admissions, but here are all the parameters that I'm using to count that. And again, it's just super easy to understand that. One of the things that's really like genius about this measure is that he also calls out that he's taking into account encounters that haven't finished yet, right? So assuming that this is a report that is going to be updated with some sort of regular frequency, there's very much the possibility that there's an encounter that has started when this data is processed, but hasn't ended yet. So having that potential issue solved for with this kind of a measure, again, like that kind of forward thinking it's really, really smart. And I like that you're specifically calling that out and taking credit for that, because again, we don't have insight into the measures with the way that we're sharing these reports. So that would have totally been lost. And I love that you're taking credit for that, because it's really, really smart. It talks about the second page a little bit, and then gets into the design, right? That KPI overview page, that first page, and then the explanatory analysis on the second page. And finally, he kind of wraps up with the insights. And again, like this is another piece or another component that I really liked about the submission, is he took time to actually write down and provide the answers to the different questions, right? So how many patients have been admitted or readmitted over time? And you can clearly see those called out here. Same thing with the average stay, right? Average cost. Again, I think this is really great work in providing those specific answers there. A lot of times we don't see this kind of stuff. They're either buried, within text or detail within the report, or you have to figure it out from the visuals. So I like that he's bringing this right to the consumer. All right, so scroll back up and jump into the report. So again, it's a super clean report. I think he very much accomplishes that, at a glance ability to digest and understand what's going on. Again, like looking at the count of admissions in March 2019, all of these labels are dynamic and update based on filter changes that are made to the year and the month. Love that. That stuff is great. We can see whether it's an increase or a decrease compared to the last month. We can see those percentages both in terms of volume and percentage. And then we have that broken down by the different categories. So again, like each of these kind of KPI charts here packs a lot of detail, but they're also really easy to interpret. I also think that this is something that could be, potentially printed out, and handed out to folks for the prior month, right? It's not so cumbersome to try to digest or understand that you couldn't say like, hey, here's a handout for a meeting. We're going to go through these charts, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think those are some of the big pieces that I really, really liked. One of the things that was interesting that we didn't see a lot of, but again, I'm sure that there was a very valid decision behind this, is we have a select all for the month, right? But we don't have a select all for the year or a multi-year select. Again, I totally get that from a report creation and design standpoint, having like multiple years trended out is a different requirement that you're trying to solve for. But it would be potentially cool to see some of those, year over year changes to kind of understand those trends in context there. But yeah, overall, I love this. Really, really great work.
Yeah, I think this bottom visual is so cool. This one really caught my eye. At first, I was shocked just because I've been to MGH and it's a massive hospital. So seeing the max bed capacity was 3 there, it's like, how do you get to that? And then in the write-up though, he talks about that he just set an assumption. And again, that's one of the limitations of this type of challenge versus on the job. And it's definitely something that could be tweaked if you had the correct information at your disposal. But again, it was a little jarring knowing that there are thousands of rooms in MGH and just me imagining just 3 beds very spaced out. But yeah, I love this report. Again, I think, we've seen some examples of, some very, very detailed in-depth reports. And then we see like one pagers like this. It just really hits so many high notes. And yeah, I really, there's a lot to love about the layout and just the simplicity of this, while also communicating some really great information here.
Yeah, I agree with your point, Chris. The max 3 bed capacity is shocking. And again, it's important to remember that this is a subset of the data. Like it's harder to notice, but I mean, even if you just look at admissions, right? Like 2,200 admissions in a whole calendar year, especially with the way we're defining admissions here, which is, I think it's just an encounter really. Like even then you'd think, I mean, there's no way that few people visit the hospital in an entire year. It's just harder to know. But I think just going back to the dashboard itself, I love that, to Chris's point, one pager with the 4 main blocks that are directly tied to the 4 things that we were asking for in the challenge prompt, right? Admissions, granted, we don't really have the readmissions here, fair enough. Then, durations, cost per visit, and covered by insurance. And it's all put in that context of like current period versus previous period. And once you showcase that kind of filter by month functionality, Aaron, I noticed that comment where it says like, if you select a month, it will like current period will be that month and it'll compare to the previous month. But if you do select all, then it'll compare this year to previous year. So I think it's a quite a clever way of kind of zooming out if you want to do year over year or month over month. Even if I think there's another page here that I noticed, because another part of the prompt was to like, yes, also provide some insights to the stakeholders like outside of the report. And I love that it's kind of included as a separate page here where they're calling out something that we kind of saw in the other reports when they were talking about the insurance agents. But here it's very clearly called out that there's, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that just aren't covering like any of their patients, and at least in this data, and just how much money that could potentially cost the hospital, if those patients aren't able to cover those costs as well. And I think the next slide over, which is really interesting, not the next slide, the next visual is talking about there's 2 sort of procedures in general, which pretty much like take up the bulk of the cost of procedures, which is that atrial fibrillation. I don't know what that is. And then just common pregnancy, and just seeing that trended out is very interesting as well. And then underneath that is right for those 2 most common and most costly, like what's the, coverage percentage? And there's some notable differences between atrial fibrillation, which is kind of covered or like 3/4 of the time, versus common pregnancy, which is under half plus a little chunk of like low coverage. So I think it's just a really clever way of showing like additional insights that they found beyond the ones that, to your point, Aaron, were mentioned, like answers to each of the questions as well. So yeah, this is kind of great second little page there that kind of similar to Mark's, right? Like, oh, want more detail? Like, here you go. And it's very specific. Last finalist here, Marianne Melis. I think if you look at the report, at first glance, to me, this is kind of like the perfect representation of what the challenge prompt was, which was like top level KPI report for executives that shows recent trends, right? Why? Because you've got, this single page report, you've got 3 clear categories. Granted, they're not directly mapped to the 4 questions in the prompt, but that's okay. 3 clear subcategories and then trends for each one, right? You got consistency as well. You've got these KPI cards. You've got the comparison to the previous period. And then you've got some other kind of notes and some secondary lines in there as well, some of which are really clever. Again, I keep ringing the same bell, but you've got admitted patients separated with no intended overnight stay, and these notes on average stay 2.2 days, but 80% leaves within 25 hours, right? Average stay 6.6 hours, 80% leaves within 1.8. So again, those very clear notes, and overall just focusing here on the yearly trend, we see the whole 10 years of data, as you can see here, but I think there's a clever way of zooming in where you can change to a quarter view where you're looking at the last 12 quarters instead, and everything kind of updates, or you can go one level deeper and look at the last, I think, 24 months. So I think that was very clever. Again, very consistent. So it just feels very approachable and very executive. I like the write-up as well, kind of setting the stage, going through some of the data prep, data modeling steps, some of those thoughts before starting, right? I want to have a 1-page dashboard. I have some key insights that the prompt is always asking for, or also asking for, but I'm going to keep those separate, and we'll see those in another page as well. And then you're kind of that very deliberate filtering of zooming in year, quarter, month. Some design choices always tailored to the stakeholder, and then the use of SVG visuals. This is more of like the notes here at the end, which is quite neat. If we go back up and a little bit deeper though, and I think it's interesting talking about marks. I think at first glance you think, oh no, this is too much, and then you start to dig into it, and the more you start to love it, and the more each chart is very effective. I think here some of the charts, I think beyond the first 3, which are very intuitive, right? Total encounters and then separated between admissions and non-admissions. Some of these start to get a little bit confusing to me. You have claimed costs and then calculated costs and then average cost encounter based on calculated costs. Granted, these are all defined, but it's still just not very intuitive to me. And some of these have pretty much the same trends. So it begs the question of maybe we should have chosen some different metrics to tell separate stories. That said, I do think this is something that on a new iteration of the dashboard can be very easily improved. And I think right now, clear purpose, right decisions most of the time. And I think it's a great starting off point for executives to immediately start using. Although there are some tweaks that I think I'd immediately start making, particularly just to some of the metrics chosen, which is fair enough.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree. I think that there's a lot to kind of glean from just this one page, but I also I see your point where, it's very simple. It's a lot of information, but at the same time, some of that is a little bit more, the definitions are a little bit complicated, and there could potentially be other data to present in another way that would give a little bit more insight. So I think I agree here. Really great V1. And I think that, with a little bit of iteration and feedback could really be useful for executives moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me here is it's almost like the intent here was to create a small multiples style visual without breaking it out that way, using that same kind of category to break to break them down. But I think exactly what you highlighted, some of the challenges with the small multiple visuals is that information overload and not being able to really, you're surfacing a lot of data points that they become hard to compare, top to bottom or category to category, depending on how it's used there. So I really like the approach of this. I really think it's cool to be able to say hey, kind of looking at encounters, it's a mix between a funnel and that small multiple where you're hey, I'm going to start off with total encounters, and then I'm going to say encounters where there was an admitted patient, and then when there was no intended overnight stay, and looking at different segments there. But again, I think that some of the insight and stuff is a little bit hard to glean from it. But yeah, so agree with you guys. Great V1. Love the layout of this and the intent of the visuals.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say I don't have a ton to add. I agree generally. I would love to see a little bit more detail in some areas and a couple missing metrics for me, particularly readmissions, et cetera. But one thing that I do love is I think it's so cool how, when we think about robust statistics, particularly for medical care, just the fact that she's 80% of people leave within 2.3 hours, run up against the average of, 4.3, which it's really important to, understand what like the vast majority of people are doing in a field where, outliers can really skew those. So I do think that there was a lot of great thinking here as well. But I think, yeah, there's just a few metrics that either missing or, compared to a few other, like, we just like to see a little more detail and a little bit like different angles of this data.
All right. That's all the finalists. So now that we've covered all five, I'll just kind of go back to the challenge prompt. Who do we think put together the best executive KPI dashboard to gauge recent performance in the 4 key areas that we talked about? Any initial preferences by anyone?
This is a tough one. I guess for me, I'm sort of leaning between Michael's and Mark's, and it's just a question of like, analytical depth, and just like the variety, and just if I'm an executive that really wants to dig into the data, I might skew towards Mark. But Michael's like single page report to me is probably the best single executive summary. And so yeah, I'm really struggling right now between, do I go with like the super in-depth technical one, or just the one that, I like the way that Aaron phrased, you could print this out, and a lot of executives still do print things out and look at them. And I think that you would have a very easy time, sharing that with folks who might just want a very simple but effective report.
Enrique, can you bring up, is it Andrew? Can you click on Andrew's real quick? So I am similarly struggling, where I could make strong cases for Mark, Michael. I think Andrew's a bit like, I very much second everything that Chris just said, right? About like being able to like print out Michael's and hand that out, and how simple it is, right? But then with Mark's, like I really do like that he is providing so much detail and information here, and he is tackling all 4 of the key objectives, or all of those main objectives. But with Andrew's report, again, like I think the ability to drill in by the segment, just the filter ability, it is a one-sheeter, right? It really is just, he's packing so much into this one view. I don't have the report pulled up on me, but do we have like the readmission pieces
For which one?
as part of Andrew's?
I mean, I think there's probably some calculation errors in his, because you get
right
100%
for all
from
years.
how I've found it, no matter how you slice it. Oh, it looks
one
like
one year has 83.
83.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a couple that are lower.
But I wager that these, I mean, there's not a lot of specified on how it's calculated, but I do think that this might not be very accurate, to be perfectly fair.
Okay. Yeah, but from again, like giving a little bit of grace with the calculation error there, like again, to me, like if I was picking kind of top 3, like I think these 3 would be the top, and potentially in the order that you've got them.
And any thoughts yourself?
I mean, I'm kind of agreeing with what Aaron and Chris have said. I think that Mark's, and like if I'm thinking about visually, I think that Andrew and Michael are really great, but informationally and analytically, Mark's like by far and away has the most information and the most insight. So I agree with kind of where they are in order. I think it just really comes down for me, if we're talking more like what does an executive level KPI dashboard mean in the hospital setting specifically. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, it's tough. I actually quite like Nicoline's as well. I just think like, I mean, I agree with the points that you made at the end, Chris, on this, but again, something that you can very easily just, get rid of the image. But I love those insurance charts that you mentioned, Aaron. I think they're doing a lot with the like admissions as well, that we saw other people like admissions and readmissions, and we've got these kind of funnels as well. Again, and even if like the definition was slightly different from others, something that you can very quickly tweak. Yeah, I'm struggling. I agree with. Go ahead, Chris.
I just want to chime in and say, like, I think it's great to have fun during challenges. So like, even though I just wanted to call out that like professionally, I probably wouldn't go with that front page, but like, again, she did state that her goal was to get extra practice with the HTML. And I think this is really fun in a challenge setting. So I'm not deducting any, imaginary points here for that. I just wanted to call that out, but I think it is really cool to have this landing page, because it would be useful in a lot of contexts, the actual tech and procedures behind this for sure. But
I do just want to also call out that 2 of her other goals were to learn to work with Power BI and learn to write DAX. And the fact that she accomplished those goals pretty well in this report, I'm sure she has practiced at other points, but that is quite the feat. So, just kind of throwing that one in there too, that on top of building this very streamlined looking dashboard, she also did all of that.
All right. So it looks like we're kind of leaning mostly these two. I don't know if you're all comfortable with voting between Mark and Michael's for the winner. Yeah, I guess the dilemma is what constitutes an executive KPI report, right? I guess that's for each of us to determine individually. It's hard. I don't know if everyone has their vote in their head already, or if there's anything else that we want to discuss.
It makes me nervous. We have an even number of people.
I know.
Yeah.
We'll see. I mean, if we have a tie, we'll maybe that'll open the discussion further, or
So is everybody kind of okay with having Mark and Michael as like the 2 to vote between? I mean, I don't want to shut down Andrew or Nicoline.
Yeah, I think that these 2 are my top 2. So I'm
okay.
Yeah, I mean, if we had all 4, would you vote for someone that wasn't Michael or Mark? I guess that's another question.
Say that again.
If we were voting for all 4, would you vote for someone that was? Would you vote for Andrew or Nicoline?
I mean, personally, probably not. I just wanted to make sure. I feel like we got to that point really quickly, so I just wanted to make sure that that we were all aligned on that.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, we are splitting hairs a little bit, but I am leaning. I think, I've kind of aligned towards those, but
okay.
All right, we'll do Mark 1, Michael 2. Everyone's ready. 1, 2, 3.
Oh,
okay, so we do have a tie. Oh no. I don't know.
I was so on the fence. Like, honestly, they're so different, and I just stuck with the simpler one. But I don't know.
I'm pretty firmly not on the fence, actually.
Okay,
interesting.
I don't know. I think Brano and Aaron convinced me when we were talking about it earlier this week with what is at this level. Yes, it would be nice to have a 1-pager, but hospital data and medical data is so complex that it almost feels too simple. So, I mean, if everybody else is for Michael, that's fine, but you're all wrong.
I mean, I'm not opposed to swapping my vote. I am very I'm not adamant about either. Usually I have a more of a flag planted here, but
I don't know. I mean, I'm flipping back and forth between the 2 of them, and I feel like I can make a strong case for both of them, where, I mean, to everybody's point, Mark's is not the typical at a glance, executive, or traditionally executive style dashboard that we're used to, right? I still think he has those top kind of KPIs. They look different, right? It does take a little bit longer to kind of interpret or understand. One thing that I would say is that, say you're presenting this report for the first time, right? And it's a consistent format. What's better over time? Is Mark's report going to be a better long-term solution for this kind of a KPI report than Michael's is going to be? Is Michael's going to need to be evolved to add in more detail or more information? I think in the context of this challenge, Michael's was easier to all right, I'm going in, I'm looking at this, I can clearly understand it. I've got the 4 kind of main questions answered. Yeah, the readmission piece isn't addressed here, but right, he doesn't cover readmissions in this. But still, in the context of the challenge, it's easy to go in here, kind of understand what's going on. Similarly, if you were handing this to an executive for the first time, it'd be super easy to understand as well. I've got my kind of quadrant here, and go from there. But I think that the level of detail provided in those top 3 or 4 visuals on each page that Mark provides, I think the point about looking to the future, right, and not just having it filters and stuff set up or trends set up to accommodate data in the future. I could also make a case for this is going to potentially accommodate future requests, right? Or other pieces of data that the exec team would potentially want to see as part of that, because that stuff changes and evolves. I always ask for a little bit more context or, a little bit more insight into what's going on. I just think the way that the charts are built and laid out and the data that they present, that is going to help this report stay as is for longer than Michael's potentially would.
And I'm starting to get swayed.
Next thing you know, it's going to be the opposite tie.
Yeah.
I mean, we could just vote again. It's simple as, right? Maybe we won't have a tie this time.
Maybe. Let's do it. See
Let's
what
do it.
happens.
Marcus 1, Michael's 2.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
All right. Enrique
switch.
waiting. Now.
Yeah,
Like it.
I think to everyone's point, like maybe this is what I was expecting at first when reading the challenge prompt, but I do think it meets it. And I think, yeah, maybe at first it's long for executives, but to Aaron's point, maybe this is exactly what they were expecting, right? And like the decisions will be easier to make after this. There's just so much good stuff in here, and so clearly laid out for anyone to understand, even in this complex field. That, yeah, it's hard to not applaud Mark. So let's do that. Congratulations, Mark, on winning the Maven Hospital Challenge. We'll give you a not silent round of applause since no one's on mute.
Great work, Mark.
Yeah, great work. As a prize, you'll take home a free annual membership to Maven and a custom Maven Challenge winner t-shirt. So be on the lookout for that. Congratulations once again. And thanks everyone who continues to participate. Hopefully you'll continue to participate as we come up with new challenges. We've got a very exciting one coming up. We hope to see you there. Thanks, guys.